Excellent. Well, I'm super pumped to see you all here today. Thank you again for joining us and welcome. This session is Internal Controls One-on-One, Reducing Risk in Day-to-Day Operations. Internal controls might sound technical, but they're really just the everyday habits and safeguards that keep our work accurate and our organizations protected. And chances are you're already using them. Here to walk us through this is our instructor, Tamara Horton. Tamara brings deep experience in federal financial management, budgeting, accounting, audit readiness, and process improvement. She began her career with the Department of the Army and later moved into consulting, helping DoD and DHS agencies strengthen internal controls, preparing for major audits, and streamline their financial workflows. Today, she brings that real world expertise straight to you all. Tamara, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Amanda, and welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you as we talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, internal controls. Let me share my screen and we will get this presentation going. Um, like Amanda mentioned, we will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so you can drop those in the Q&A function in Zoom now or just keep them in mind and ask them later on once we get to them. All right, so internal controls 101. This is going to be all about how you can reduce risk in your day-to-day operations because internal controls don't just affect people that count beans. It's not just for accountants, it's for everyone. We have a few learning objectives for today. First of all, we want to have a better understanding of what internal controls are. We want to talk about why they matter, how they help reduce the risk of fraud, waste, abuse, and just incorrect reporting in our day-to-day operations. And we'll talk about some of those common risks and control weaknesses that government organizations face and the different types of controls and when they're used, how they're used, and how those strong internal controls can really support audit readiness, not just during an audit, but all year long. And most importantly, I want this to be practical. My goal is for you to leave with a few ideas that you can take back and apply in your work right away. I want to start this out with a poll. Tell me in the poll, please, what is your experience when it comes to internal controls? Are you new? Do you know the basics? Do you work with them regularly? Or are you responsible for oversight and testing of internal controls? And we'll give it a few seconds here for everyone to weigh in. Good deal. Oh, it looks like a lot of you are working with controls on a regular basis, and a good portion of you are actually responsible for oversight or testing. That's great. So I am in good company today. So just starting with the basics, what are internal controls? They're not just one thing. They're a set of processes built to give reasonable assurance that objectives will be achieved. Um, Not that they're going to go without a hitch or be perfect. We're talking about reducing risk enough that leadership can rely on the system that the internal control is affecting. And there's a couple of different ways to look at them. Operations, for example, that's about how the organization runs every day. And the focus of those internal controls are going to be on efficiency and effectiveness of those operations. So really, we can just ask, are we doing things the right way without wasting resources or having unnecessary duplication of effort or rework? So we want our processes to work correctly, on time, every time, and without duplication of effort. And then we have reporting. Reporting is really focusing on the quality of information. That includes internal reports as well as external reports, including our financial reports at the end of the year. So the key thing there is, can leadership trust the numbers and can auditors trust the numbers? Because even good decisions can go wrong if they're based on bad data. And then we have compliance. Are we following the laws, the regulations, and the policies that our business is involved with? This is very important in federal environments because we have a lot of different things that we have to maintain compliance with. So the big question is, are we doing what we're required to do? And most compliance problems are not intentional. They come from unclear processes or missing internal controls or misapplied internal controls. And so all of these three areas, operations, reporting, and compliance, are the why behind internal controls. And everything else in the Green Book is designed to support these outcomes. Why do they matter? Internal controls are not just a check the box exercise or something designed to satisfy auditors. They are truly about helping organizations achieve their missions and do it well. At the federal level, we are responsible for managing taxpayer resources wisely. So, good internal controls help us to ensure that funds are used as intended and safeguarded from things like fraud, waste, and abuse. They also help make our work more efficient because when processes are clear and responsibilities are well defined, there are fewer errors and less rework, as well as fewer surprises at the end of the fiscal year. And strong internal controls help us improve accountability. They make it clear who is responsible for what and provide confidence that decisions and transactions can be supported if they ever get questioned during an audit or anything else. And ultimately, good internal controls help us all accomplish our missions more effectively while maintaining the public's trust, because these are not government dollars, these are our dollars that are being used here. So we want to make sure that the public trusts where the money is going. So ultimately, internal controls are not about avoiding problems, they're about creating an environment that operates reliably and responsibly. Now, here this slide talks about the federal framework. I'm sure all of you are familiar with some of these. The GAO Green Book is where the standards for internal controls in the federal government get defined. We have FMFIA, the Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act of 1982, which required federal executive branch entities to establish internal controls in accordance with those standards. The standards provide criteria for assessing the design, implementation, and operating effectiveness of internal controls in federal government entities to help us determine whether such systems are effective or not. OMB Circular A-123, that's where we get to define the standards that the executive branch agencies have to follow in order to establish, maintain, and then assess our internal controls. And the primary goal there is to protect the taxpayer resources, as well as prevent fraud, waste, and abuse, and help ensure operational accountability across the federal government. And so if you work in USDA or you work in DOD or you work in MDA, you're going to be using this Circular A-123. And then we have our annual assurance process. That's generally referring to the mandatory yearly compliance procedures that are required by U.S. government agencies. The exact requirements might vary depending on where you work, but it almost always involves an annual self-assessment, risk evaluations, and an official attestation of compliance that gets signed by executive leadership. And there's a whole lot of other things that I could throw in here when we talk about internal controls, but these are some big players when it comes to what you would be looking at on an annual basis or even a weekly or daily basis, depending on what you're doing with internal controls. Now, there are 5 components that represent the highest level of the hierarchy of standards for internal controls, and they are the control environment, which is going to establish the organization's culture and ethical values, accountability, and expectations surrounding your internal controls. Risk assessment, that's going to help us identify and evaluate risks that could prevent the organization from achieving its objectives. The control activities themselves, which are the policies, the procedures, the workflows, the approvals, and the reviews required to reduce risk. And then our information and communication, that's designed to help ensure that employees receive, share, and document the information needed to perform their roles responsibly. And then lastly, monitoring. Monitoring is designed to evaluate whether controls are operating effectively and identify opportunities for improvement. And together, these components create a framework for managing risk, achieving objectives, and maintaining accountability. And they all work hand in hand. None of these are more important than the other. It does require all five of these components to really be successful with managing internal controls. We'll go over each of these individual, starting with control environment. That's the foundation of every internal control system. You can think of it as the organization's culture because it shapes how people make decisions and approach their work every day. I'm sure everybody has heard the term tone at the top. Tone at the top is where the leadership is setting the example. And when leadership sets the example for integrity and accountability and ethical compliance and a commitment to doing things the right way, then your employees are going to be much more likely to follow that example. It also is important that the tone at the top has a good understanding of the importance of internal controls and audit readiness, not just at the end of the year, but every single day. The control environment also helps establish expectations for people. It answers questions like what behaviors are acceptable? How are people held accountable if they don't do the right thing? What values guide our decisions in our everyday workflows? If executives and management teams disregard existing controls, then employees are likely to follow suit. Because just like toddlers, employees follow what you do more than what you say. And over time, this can create vulnerabilities across the system. Compliance can also happen from the bottom up since audit teams can use their data to make a business case for risk management. Now, even the best written policies won't be effective if the culture doesn't support them. That's why the control environment influences every other component of internal controls. It helps to create the conditions that allow the rest of the system to work effectively. Then we have risk assessment. Risk assessment is the process of asking what could happen to prevent us from achieving our objectives. And those risks can come from inside or outside the organization. Things inside like staffing shortages, turnover, outdated processes or policies, or from outside, things like new regulations or laws, cybersecurity threats, or changes in funding. Once we identify those risks, we evaluate how likely they are to occur and what the impact would be if they did. And that is going to help us prioritize where to focus our attention and our resources, and also help us to come up with like mitigation plans for if those things actually happen, what would we do to immediately respond to those things? Now, it's also important to remember that risk assessment is not a one-time exercise. As technology, operations, or the external environment changes, our risks change too. And an effective organization regularly reassesses its risks and adjusts its controls accordingly. And where we sit in 2026 with the influx of AI and robotics and automation and machine learning, and then the upset with all of the changes that have been taking place in the federal government, we really have to do a good job of paying attention to risks and constantly update them as new ones are uncovered. Then we talk about control activities. Control activities are the specific actions that we take every day to reduce risk. These are the policies, the procedures, the second level reviews, the sanity checks that help ensure that our work is completed accurately, consistently, and in compliance with all of the requirements that we have. A simple example would be the purchasing process. Ideally, one person initiates the purchase and a different person approves it. And then a different person than those first two recorded that document or records that transaction in the financial system with clear documentation. Separating those responsibilities makes it harder for errors or intentional misuse to go unnoticed. Another common one would be reconciliations. These are considered detective controls because they don't necessarily prevent something from happening, but they help identify mistakes after the fact so they can be corrected before they become bigger problems. Now, the control activities is the component that most people are familiar with because it's what they see in their day-to-day work. It's also where auditors spend a lot of time looking for evidence that controls are operating as designed. Now, the important thing I want you to remember here is that these activities should be matched to the risks that they're intended to address, and they should be documented. From the DoD perspective, specifically the Army, we have a control catalog that we hand over to auditors, as well as using them internally with our organizations to define exactly what these control activities should be, who's doing them, how often they're being done, and how they're documented. Now we talk about information and communication. Even the best designed controls won't be effective if the right information isn't reaching the right people at the right time. Communication is what keeps the entire control system working. And that communication needs to flow in multiple directions. Downward, when leadership communicates expectations and policies to staff. Upward, when employees report concerns, errors, or emerging risks or weaknesses to management. And then laterally, when departments share information and coordinate their efforts. Documentation is just as important as communication because, from an audit perspective, if a control wasn't documented, it's very difficult to prove that it actually happens. I think of it like I'm not a lawyer, but I think of it like a legal case. It's all about the evidence. What proof do you have that that took place? And good documentation provides evidence that that control was performed consistently. Now, in many federal organizations, control failures are not caused by poor procedures, they're caused by poor communication or poor documentation. Someone knew about an issue and failed to report it, or information didn't make it past the individual to the people who really needed it in order to act. And that's why clear communication and documentation are essential parts of an effective internal control system. And now let's talk about monitoring. Monitoring is the feedback loop that keeps the entire internal control system working. Without it, even well-designed controls can gradually become less effective as processes, people, and risks change over time. I'm sure we've all worked in organizations where the subject matter expert leaves and then other people have to take over that role and things fall apart. It's important that we maintain that information and that we can duplicate the efforts. We want to have it done the same way. You want your processes to be repeatable and reproducible by anyone who picks it up. And that's another reason why documentation is so important because there is turnover in the federal government. People retire. We've got a lot of people that are facing retirement right now, and we want to make sure that we are able to continue operations appropriately, and that includes monitoring when those people leave. Now, monitoring happens two different ways. The first is ongoing monitoring, which is including things like supervisory reviews, dashboards, status updates, reconciliations, and routine management oversight. And then the second is separate evaluations. That's things like independent reviews, internal audits, or formal assessments that take a fresh look at whether those controls are working as intended. Now, it's important to remember that monitoring is not just about checking compliance or looking for mistakes. It's about identifying opportunities to improve our processes, strengthen our controls, and adapt to changing risks. A control system that is not monitored will eventually drift away from its original design. And that's why monitoring naturally feeds back into risk assessment. It helps organizations identify new risks, adjust their controls accordingly, and continuously improve over time. And we hear this all the time, continuous improvement. It sounds like a buzzword, but it really is very important for us to constantly be looking for ways to improve our operations, and improve our quality, improve our outcomes, because we are responsible for taxpayer resources. And it is important that we continue to refine our processes and policies accordingly because, as I'm sure you're not the only one facing this problem, we are continuously asked to do more with less. More work, more responsibilities, more tasks, more reporting with less money, less resources, less staff. And so we want to be as efficient and effective as we possibly can. And monitoring is a way to help us ensure that. This slide is directly from the GAO Green Book, Figure 3, if you want to go look at it yourself. And this slide highlights an important distinction that people often overlook. We hear the terms policies, procedures, controls, and control activities used almost interchangeably, but they are not exactly the same thing. So I like to think of it this way. Policies tell people what is expected, while procedures explain how to do it. And together, those policies and procedures create the organization's controls. And within those controls are the control activities. Those are the specific actions that people take in order to reduce risk. So, for example, a policy might require supervisory approval for purchases over a specific dollar amount. The procedure explains how that approval is obtained, and then the actual approval itself is the control activity. So, all three work together. It's also important to remember that they're not operating in isolation. A single control can support multiple objectives, and multiple controls often work together to address the same risk. An effective internal control system is really a network of interconnected controls, all working together towards helping the organization achieve its mission while managing risk and any weaknesses. And so, this relationship between the policies and procedures, controls, and control activities are depicted here in this Figure 3 directly from the GAO Green Book. There are three primary types of controls, and understanding the difference between them is helpful when evaluating any process. First, we've got preventive controls. Preventive controls are designed to stop problems before they happen. Things like approvals, segregation of duties, required training, or system access restrictions. Those are all things that are designed to help prevent errors or fraud from occurring in the first place. And then we have detective controls. Detective controls come into play after an event has occurred, and their job is to identify errors, irregularities, or control failures. Examples include things like reconciliations, management reviews, exception reports, and internal audits. And then we have corrective controls. Corrective controls address the problem once it's been identified. They fix the issue, they determine the root cause, and they make changes to reduce the likelihood that it happens again. So, looking at all three of these together, it's kind of a simple progression. Prevent it if you can, detect it if you can't, and then correct it if it happens so it doesn't happen again. And we'll look at each one of these a little bit more in depth here. So, preventive controls, that's your first line of defense. Their purpose is to stop errors or fraud or inefficiencies before they happen, rather than dealing with the consequences afterward. And that's really what we want. We want to prevent things from happening, but we can't always do that. So that's why we have the other two. But examples of preventive controls include segregation of duties, which, in my opinion, is the number one easiest and most impactful control in existence. We don't want the same person able to authorize and then pay for something because it increases the likelihood of fraud, waste, and abuse. But it also includes things like approval requirements, access restrictions, and standardized processes. I worked with GFEBs for many years, working for the Army, and we had different levels given to us, different approval authorities and things right in the system to prevent us from being able to do things like open a transaction and also authorize payment for that transaction. And so you probably have something similar in your system And one of the biggest advantages of preventive controls is consistency. By building the right checks into a process from the beginning, organizations can improve accuracy, support compliance, and reduce the amount of rework that might be required later on. So these controls are going to guide employees towards the correct way of doing things and reduce the opportunity for mistakes or unauthorized actions. And strong preventive controls save us time and money. They help prevent unauthorized transactions, catch potential posting errors before financial reports get generated at the end of the year or on a quarterly basis, and it reduces the need for investigations or corrections. It also makes reconciliations much smoother. As they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Now, here are some examples of what preventive controls look like in practice. Of course, we know they're designed to stop problems before they occur. So these are kind of like guardrails that reduce the likelihood of errors, fraud, waste, abuse, or noncompliance. Segregation of duties, I've mentioned, it's considered the number one control because it prevents any one person from having too much control over a process. In an ideal environment, different people perform different parts of a transaction. For example, one employee would create a purchase request, and then a different person would approve that purchase request. And then someone else receives the goods once they get shipped to your organization. And then another person processes the payment. And then a different person from any of those others performs the reconciliation. By dividing up those responsibilities, it becomes much more difficult for errors or fraud to either occur in the first place or go undetected. Now, every organization may not have enough staff to fully separate every duty. And if that happens, then smaller offices may have one person wearing multiple hats. When segregation of duties isn't practical, management should implement compensating controls, such as additional supervisory reviews or independent reconciliations or increased oversight to prevent a similar level of assurance. Other examples of preventive controls include approval requirements, role-based system access, spending limits on government purchase cards, required training before employees receive certain authorities, automated edit checks that prevent invalid transactions from being entered, and pre-award reviews of contracts or grants. All of these controls are designed to build quality and accountability right into the process from the very beginning. And then we'll talk about detective controls. So we want to prevent things from going wrong, but if we can't, we need to be able to detect that those occurred. So detective controls happen after, but before they grow into something more significant. So we ask the question, did something go wrong? And detective controls work by reviewing the completed transactions or reports, comparing information from different sources, and looking for any unusual patterns or discrepancies. And one of our best examples is reconciliation. Whether you're reconciling a bank account, a subsidiary ledger, or another set of records, you're comparing two sources of information to make sure they agree. And if they don't agree, then that's a sign that something needs to be investigated. Reconciliations are one of the most common and most effective detective controls used throughout the government. Other examples include exception reports, which is where it might show you something that looks odd. Maybe we typically have spending limits of a certain amount, and then we have this outlier transaction that is way higher. It also can include inventory counts. It could also include variance analysis reports. If spending suddenly spikes, then we might want to look at the inventory. And if the inventory doesn't match what's on the books or a report flags an unusual transaction, those detective controls are doing what they're supposed to do. And we need to then go look further into it and see what happened. It's also important to understand the limitations of detective controls. Because they don't prevent mistakes or fraud, they identify them after the fact. That means the sooner the issues are detected, the smaller their impact is likely to be. which is why organizations use detective controls alongside preventive controls and not instead of them, because they're both very important. And the faster we do it, the more frequently we do it, the faster we're going to identify any issues that may have happened. Some examples of detective controls include reviewing of exception reports or unusual transactions. That's verifying work that's already been completed. A lot of us do monthly account reconciliations to help that our records are accurate. Exception reports highlight any unusual transactions that need a closer look. And supervisory reviews provide another set of eyes to catch errors or missing documentation before they become larger issues. I've done a lot of work with ongoing audits with the Army and from the side of remediation, audit remediation, where the auditors have already told us what went wrong and now we need to fix it. And a lot of times when they have manual data being input into a system, the auditors would like a second level reviewer to check to make sure that it was entered correctly. And I know that we can't have every single transaction looked at by somebody else because we're all very busy. But doing spot checks even really help us. Maybe you have 100 transactions and you pull out and look at 10 of them or some other amount that would be a smaller sample of those inputted transactions. Whatever we can do, we need to do. And then we also need to document that it was done so that we can hand that off to the auditor and give them a chance to look it over and determine if that internal control is effective or not. And then that also helps them determine, are our financial numbers reliable? Is our financial report at the end of the year trustworthy? Are these numbers accurate? Then we have things like inventory counts and property audits, which help to verify that assets actually exist and are where they're supposed to be. I've had the pleasure or mispleasure, depending on how you look at it, to spend time doing inventory counts in warehouses where you're physically touching every single item and reconciling them against what's on the books. Also, things like travel vouchers. Travel vouchers need to be reviewed to help identify unsupported or inappropriate expenses. Um, we have a propensity towards people charging the wrong thing to their travel card. And without doing these travel reviews, we wouldn't catch those errors. I'll give you a brief example. When I was working at Fort Irwin, there was a lady who somehow got access to both sides of the transaction. So there was no segregation of duty. She took herself on a TDY to Hawaii. She was the ODTA, the Organizational Defense Travel Administrator. So she had somehow gotten permissions for multiple things. So she issued the orders. She sent herself TDY to Hawaii when there was not a valid reason, and she just took a vacation for 2 weeks. And because of the detective controls, she was caught and she had to face consequences. She was retired early, and a new person became the ODTA because, and then we had to strengthen our internal controls because that happened. And it sounds wild. It does happen. And that was on GFEBs, which GFEBs should have these controls in the system to prevent people from being able to do such a thing. But something failed with that internal control on the preventive side. But thankfully, it was caught on the detective side. But the common theme is that detective controls provide visibility. They help organizations identify issues early enough to take action before they become much bigger and much costlier or more difficult to resolve. So think of detective controls as smoke detectors that alert organizations to issues requiring attention or correction. And then corrective controls are the final piece of the puzzle for us today. If preventive controls are designed to stop problems and detective controls are designed to find them, then corrective controls are what we do next. They are there to fix the problem, address the underlying root cause, and reduce the chances of it happening ever again. Now, the key here is root cause analysis. It's not enough to simply correct an error. We have to understand, why did it happen? Was it a poorly designed control? Was it a poor process, outdated policy, lack of training, outdated system, or not enough oversight? Once we understand the cause, we can take meaningful corrective action. And that might mean updating a policy or redesigning a workflow, providing additional training to employees, strengthening system access controls, or restoring proper segregation of duties. And often it's going to include a lot of those things, maybe not just one thing. We're probably going to need to do a policy update, a process flow update, training, and then also strengthen access controls. So, a common mistake is treating corrective actions as a one-time fix. Effective corrective controls don't just solve today's problems, they strengthen the process going forward. So, that's what makes organizations more resilient and prevents small issues from turning into recurring problems or larger losses. So, ultimately, corrective controls close the loop on the internal control cycle, and they help organizations learn from mistakes, improve their processes, and continuously strengthen their control environment. Some examples of corrective controls. Let's see. If a reconciliation uncovers an error, for example, the organization would need a correction to the journal entry. If an audit identifies a weakness, then management develops a corrective action plan, known as a CAP, to address the findings and track it all the way through its completion. And we normally have to turn these into the auditors. If we have findings from the auditors, they're going to ask us for our CAPs. They're going to want to see them, and they're going to want to test them later on too, to make sure that they actually addressed the problem and fixed it. Now, sometimes the solution is to implement compensating controls. If an organization can't fully segregate duties, for example, because of limited staffing, it might add additional supervisory reviews or independent reconciliations to help reduce risk. The common theme here is that something was already done, something happened, and then it was identified. And now the organization is taking steps to fix it and prevent it from ever happening again. So, make sure that you are thinking through, how do we correct these issues, not just for today, but going forward, so that it doesn't happen in the future. We have to strengthen the process so that we prevent these things from repeating. And that is how internal organizations continuously improve their internal control systems. Now we come to our second poll. According to the material today, what is the number one internal control? We'll give it a couple more seconds for everybody to respond. All right. Segregation of duties. 90% of you selected segregation of duties, which is what I was looking for. Now, all of these are important. Second signature requirement, IT system authorizations, and internal review before approval. They are all important, but I think if you can segregate duties, you're halfway there. Now let's talk about some risks and weaknesses with internal controls. First, looking at the risks. These are the events or conditions that could prevent an organization from achieving its objectives. Um, Things like improper payments or fraud, waste, and abuse. These have obvious financial impacts. And then we have other things like cybersecurity threats, non-compliance, or the loss of institutional knowledge when people leave. It can be just as damaging over time. Many of these risks are interconnected. For example, an outdated manual process can increase the likelihood of reporting error, while excessive reliance on contractors can introduce additional oversight and security risks. Every organization faces risks like these, and the goal is not to eliminate them completely. We can't. but to understand them and manage them effectively through strong internal controls. And then we have weaknesses. These are the gaps in the control system that make those risks more likely to occur. If you've ever read an audit report, you'll probably recognize some of these. Things like inadequate segregation of duties, poor documentation, untimely reconciliations, excessive user access, like in the case of the fraud um, travel to Hawaii, weak monitoring, or failing to follow up on known deficiencies. These are all common findings. Poor documentation is a big one. It's great if you say that you have this control, but you have to be able to prove it. Think like a lawyer. And then timeliness is so important when we talk about reconciliations. I can speak to this on a personal note. I failed to review my credit card statement in a timely manner, and I was doing a reconciliation 3 months later, and I found that I had a duplicate transaction from a vendor from my personal account. Well, I called my credit card company and they said, "Yeah, that's I can see that happened, but you only had 60 days in order to report this." And so I had to eat that cost. Those kind of things happen in the government too. So whether we're talking about personal finances or government finances, is important to do those reconciliations in a timely manner and know what those time limits are. I didn't realize that I had only 60 days to review my credit card for errors, and now I do it every single month to prevent that from happening again. Um, this is why identifying weaknesses is so important, because then we know what to look out for and we can build the processes appropriately to prevent those weaknesses turning into risks and then turning into something that might be fraud, waste, abuse, or simply an error or improper payment. So every weakness that you address makes it harder for a risk to become an actual problem. Like I've said, we got to make sure that we document things. If it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. That's a common phrase that we hear in auditing. And it might sound harsh, but it reflects reality in how the auditors evaluate controls. A control may have been performed exactly as intended, but if there's no evidence to support it, then you can't prove it happened, and auditors can't rely on it. So, when testing a control, auditors are typically trying to answer three basic questions. Was it completed? Who did it? And did that person have the appropriate authority and knowledge? When was it performed? Was it done at the required frequency and in a timely manner? For example, a monthly reconciliation completed 3 months later, not effective. And then what evidence exists? Is there documentation showing that the control occurred? This could include things like signatures, approved emails, workflow timestamps from the system, reconciliations, or even meeting minutes or system generated logs. So, auditors are not looking for documentation just for the sake of having documentation, but the evidence is going to allow them to determine whether the control was performed consistently and is operating as designed. So, if a supervisor says they reviewed a report each month, that's a statement. But if there's a report containing a signature, an approval notification, and an electronic timestamp with a date, that becomes audit evidence. So strong controls are very important, but equally important is the ability to prove that those controls actually happened. And in many audits, the issue isn't that the control didn't happen, it's that the agency can't prove it. So what can you do now? There are some practical actions that you can take to work tomorrow. Internal controls are not just management responsibility, they are everyone's responsibility. Employees are the first line of defense because they perform many of the internal controls every single day. So, some of the things that you can do is to follow established procedures rather than creating workarounds. Maintain documentation that supports transactions and decisions. Protect passwords and system access, and speak up when something doesn't look right. I love process improvement. I'm a Lean Six Sigma black belt. It's been a big part of my career. And when I find a policy or a procedure that's outdated or a process workflow that's outdated, I will bring it to someone's attention and I will typically offer to correct it or update it. Um, if you don't have time to update it yourself, you could at least raise it to the right person and say, hey, this procedure is outdated, and make a recommendation, because outdated documentation is going to set us up for failure when it comes to internal controls. And reporting errors, reporting irregularities, reporting suspected fraud, that's everyone's responsibility. If you see something, say something. We hear it all the time, and it is very, very important. And then if something is unclear, ask. What we don't want is confused employees doing the wrong thing because they were afraid of raising their hand to ask when they were unclear. And then make sure that you're participating in required training and actually paying attention to it and following what you've learned. Many significant control failures start as very small issues that no one raises, and from there they snowball. Now, if you're a manager, managers have a different responsibility within the control environment. While employees are performing many controls, managers are responsible for ensuring the controls are designed appropriately and operating effectively. So, some of the things that you can do: make sure you're clearly communicating expectations. Make sure roles and responsibilities are understood, and make sure that you review work consistently and in a timely manner. Address any identified issues instead of allowing them to become repeat findings. If something happens twice, it's a major problem. If it happens 3 or 4 times, it's going to continue to happen. You need to fix it, put a corrective action in place, and make sure that you stay on top of things, so that way when things do change, you're adjusting your internal controls and policies and procedures accordingly. Um, Managers also are establishing the tone at the top. Employees watch the leadership behavior closely and often model their actions. So think of it this way: employees execute the controls, and managers own the control environment that make those controls effective. And now we come to poll number 3, which is considered strong evidence that a control was performed. Now, I've seen all of these answered in audit conversations. The correct answer, though, is a signed or time-stamped record showing the review occurred. A policy isn't going to cut it, because a policy is telling you what should happen, not what did happen. An email discussing the review might be useful depending on what all is discussed there, but really C is going to be your strongest evidence. This slide provides references for using across the federal government when we talk about designing, implementing, and evaluating internal controls. You should be familiar with all of these. We've got the Green Book. That's the foundational framework for internal controls in the federal government, and it establishes the 5 components that we talked about and the 17 principles of internal controls, and it serves as the federal equivalent of the private sector's COSO framework. OMB Circular A-123, which establishes managers' responsibilities for internal controls and integrates internal control with enterprise risk management. And it is a key driver of an annual internal control assessment and an assurance statement. Every agency has their own policy guidance. That's going to be translating government-wide requirements into your agency-specific policies and procedures. And these are often the documents that employees interact with more frequently in their day-to-day work. We also have FISCAM. FISCAM provides auditors with guidance for evaluating information system controls and is widely used during federal financial statement audits and IT control testing. And then we have NIST SP. That's the publication providing the catalog of security and privacy controls used across federal systems and serves as the foundation for federal cybersecurity control frameworks. I will add another one that's not on the slide, and that's going to be the FAM, the Financial Audit Manual put out by GAO. And that is going to present the standardized methodology for performing financial statement audits for federal entities. And it was revised most recently in June 2026 to help effectively align federal audit procedures with professional standards for fiscal year and calendar year 2026 audits. So you don't need to memorize these resources. You just need to bookmark them and know how to search within them. Control F is your friend. Look for keywords, maybe figure out in your line of work what applies the most to you, and then just stay on top of it. Reference them whenever you need to because they do change periodically, and make sure that you're using the latest and greatest information. So we've talked about a lot when it comes to internal controls, and I will leave you with this. Effective controls do not happen by accident. They have to be thoughtfully designed, consistently followed, properly documented, and regularly monitored to make sure that they are working as intended. It all comes down to people, processes, and technologies. We've got the people who perform and monitor. We've got the processes that provide consistency and accountability, and we have the technology which enables efficiency and strengthens oversight. And together, they create strong internal controls. If any one of those elements is weak, the overall control environment becomes weak. The goal of internal controls is not to create bureaucracy. At the end of the day, strong internal controls are not just about compliance, but they are helping us achieve our missions, reduce risk, protect public taxpayer dollars, and strengthen accountability. And that is something that all of us have a role in supporting. And with that, we've got our last poll. Which internal control issue do you encounter most often in your organization? Okay, we've got a variety of answers here. It looks like the number one was documentation issue. Okay, that is not surprising, to be honest. That's my experience as well. It looks like the second largest is going to be outdated procedures. Yes, which is why continuous improvement is all of our responsibilities. We want to make sure that if we see something that's outdated, elevate that up the chain so that we can get that corrected. I also like to keep my own continuity book. Any job I've ever worked, I create my own continuity book and keep it up to date with it, to help me make sure that I've got the latest and greatest procedures. And then third, untimely reviews or reconciliations. Yeah. But all of these are issues, and um, hopefully what you learned today will help us do better. And now we go to questions. Um, please let me know if you have any questions. It looks like we have some in the Q&A portion. Amanda, what are you thinking? You want to go through some of these?
Yeah, I have one here for you. This
Sure.
one is, okay, here we go. If internal controls, wow, I promise I can say it and get it out here for you. If internal controls only provide reasonable assurance, does that mean they can still fail?
Yeah, they can absolutely fail. We want to do everything in our power to prevent and detect and correct internal controls. But things can still happen, which is why reconciliation and monitoring is so important. And it's not just a one-time thing, it is an ongoing thing. Yeah, good question.
We have another one that also came in here. What should you do if you discover that a control wasn't performed?
Mm. Well, it depends on what it is, but typically you're going to want to report it up the chain, however that makes sense for you, and then possibly make a correction depending on what that issue is. And then we're probably going to need to create a corrective action to prevent the issue from happening again, which might result in things like updating your process or your procedure. Um, you might even have to create a compensating review after you identified what caused that. Good question.
I'm reading this one here, just one second. Oh, here we go. This one is internal. This is brand new. So internal controls are not really discussed when one is given tasks to do and missions to accomplish. Also, the folks charged with watching over internal controls work in a separate silo from operational folks. So the question is, how might someone in the operational realm know who is knowledgeable of internal controls, as they might have knowledge of the Army controls catalog, or they attend today's webinar. How do they report an issue which may be controls oriented?
That can be a challenge. I know how it is when we operate in silos across organizations. Really, the number one thing is communication and knowing who the different players are. Hopefully, you have an organizational chart or something like that. And I always created my own list of POCs so that I know who to go to for certain things. Um, but if you identify what appears to be a control issue, then you're going to want to report that operational concern through your chain of command. Um, you might, just a very simple approach would be like, hey, I've noticed this approval isn't consistently happening, or only one person knows how to perform this critical process. And then frame the issue in terms of risk and weakness. And from there, offer to help if you know how to make it better. If you have an idea on how to improve that process or update the procedure or whatever it is to make it easier for the corrective action to take place, that's one thing to consider. Most organizations have internal control administrators or uh, POCs who are responsible for audit readiness. And a lot of times you even have an internal review office or an internal auditor. So I would definitely talk to those people and just become familiar with those players and then communicate with them, and then they can point you in the right direction. But good question.
Looks like we may have time for one more. Let me
Okay.
see here. Mm. What happens if a small office doesn't have enough staff to fully segregate duties?
Well, we talked about it a little bit. You're going to want to, if you can't truly segregate duties, then you need to create compensating controls, such as an additional supervisor review or an independent reconciliation or even an internal audit, in order to reduce that risk, because ultimately it's all about reducing risk. So if we can't have the segregation of duties because we don't have enough people, then we got to figure something out so that we can reduce that risk. And so you're going to want to brainstorm internally what makes the most sense for your organization so that you can prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. And with that, I think that's all we have time for questions for today. There actually was one more I saw, and I'll answer it. Yes, this session is going to be, it is recorded for playback, and you'll be able to watch that. I think it goes on YouTube. Am I right in saying that, Amanda? It
Yep,
goes on our
the
YouTube channel.
host is YouTube that it goes on. I will share. It's a great question. Sorry, my computer's locking up. I think I just froze randomly.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, I totally froze. I can see myself frozen. But I will share the link. I should be unfrozen here in a second, but I will share the link here access. It's right on our website.
Okay, yeah, it'll be on our website. And then I think it actually will be on our YouTube channel as well. If you're not familiar with the YouTube channel, you should totally check it out because it has a lot of really good information and it's got past webinars on there as well. Let me see if I can find that link real quick. Yeah, if you just go on YouTube and type in Graduate School USA, you will find our channel. And I can drop that direct link for you so that way you can find it easily.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
Tamara, I just posted. Okay.
Oh, you did? Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Shige. Yeah, no, my Zoom's locked up here, so I might have
Okay.
to exit here. I apologize.
Well, I appreciate everybody's time and attention. Really appreciate it. And Amanda, I'll let you close us out.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Give a great round of applause to Tamara here. I know that there was a lot of information that she provided. Thank you so much, Tamara. That was excellent. And we hope to see you guys in any future webinars that we have. And also note that this is available, like we said earlier, for a recording for you to reference at any time. Hope you all
Yep.
have an amazing week.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Tamara. Thanks, Shige.